Let me put it this way. War is possible anytime the weapons are there. That includes nuclear war, of course, which is possible because nuclear weapons exist. Ongoing deep-seated disagreements, both between nuclear weapon states and in connection with the possible expansion of the number of nuclear weapon states in the near future, are doing nothing to reduce the threat of nuclear war. I would not attribute that kind of direct effect to the current pandemic, but it could definitely have side effects on disarmament and international security. I'm talking about the economic consequences, not so much of the pandemic, but of the measures aimed at preventing it, at preventing its spread. These measures are having a very serious impact on economic life, and they have already caused full-fledged economic crises in a number of countries, including countries with advanced economies. We cannot even come close to estimating the consequences of these crises. The ramifications may be political, and it is highly likely that they will turn out to be military if the economic downturn leads to a social explosion of any kind, or an increase in political polarization that will ultimately be resolved by military means. If we talk about how the pandemic might affect the fundamental principles of international security, then we must remember that these principles are not immutable. Major global crises usually lead to a system rebalancing. The crisis that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s should have brought forth a new system for international security, but it didn't. The American-centric world, Pax Americana, that brief period of undivided US dominance, was based on a set of tools inherited from the Cold War, including the UN and the Security Council, including a set of specific treaties. But it couldn't go on like that forever. We are seeing the end of undivided American dominance, as many predicted about 20 years ago. And we see that the old security system has ceased to work. First with the collapse of the treaty system, and second with the paralysis of institutions such as the UN Security Council, which in truth can only resolve secondary issues that do not affect the participants' vital interests. Will this situation lead to the establishment of a new system? In theory, it should, but everyone has pointing to this crisis for more than a decade. They were talking about it back in the 2000s. It's the 2020s now. On the one hand, the processes seem to have accelerated, but on the other hand, everyone is so unwilling to change anything that it looks like an even larger shakeup is needed for change to happen. Let us hope that this shakeup does not turn out to be a real, large-scale war. I don't think so. Global Zero is not an achievable goal, primarily for technical reasons. Once a country reaches a certain level of development, the laws of physics and its own production potential allow it to build nuclear weapons. No ban will prevent that from happening. Weapon bans, whether religious, ideological, or of any other kind, have never worked. At different times, different institutions have tried to ban all sorts of things. The Church once tried to ban crossbows. Then they tried to ban firearms. Those bans obviously did not work. They did not even slow down weapon development. The situation with nuclear weapons is slightly different, since they require a significantly higher level of technological development than anything that came before. But it isn't rocket science. Let's not forget that nuclear weapons are a technology from the 1940s. Nuclear weapons, many countries are capable of that level of technology today. They could build nuclear weapons at any moment, provided they have the political will. Literally within a few months. Limiting this process is only possible by forcibly limiting the economic development of certain countries and regions. But that is a more difficult task, and it is not easier to solve. It is as unsolvable as a ban on weapons development in general. All we can do is hope to limit their use, and hope that nuclear weapon states actually have, and ought to have, a sufficiently high level of political culture that they can negotiate with each other. For 80 years, the world managed to limit itself to a single use case, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Since then, everyone seems to prefer to negotiate. Will nuclear weapon states continue to prefer negotiation? I hope so, of course, but the fact that economic and industrial capabilities make it possible to build such weapon means that it is impossible to limit their development politically. And there is always the possibility that they will continue to spread and will eventually be used. Unfortunately, there is no answer to that question, just like in the old joke about the mice and the owl. When the mice ask the owl how to escape from the cats, the owl tells them to turn themselves into hedgehogs. The mice say, "That's a great idea, but how do we do it?" "Sorry," the owl replies, "I'm not interested in tactics. I'm a strategist." We can avoid the issue by repeating the same old things about the need to create a new, more just system for international security, but no one has the recipe for that system. We can argue in theory that the world should make more of an effort to take into account the concerns of different countries, that serious conflicts like the one we see between Russia and the West, for example, simply should not exist. And yet, we can clearly trace the entire history of the emergence and the development of this particular conflict, starting from the honeymoon between Russia and the United States after the collapse of the USSR, and ending with today's current events. The mistakes both parties made along the way are easy enough to see, but it already happened and cannot be fixed. Of course, we are all humans, and it is human nature to make mistakes. It is human nature to experience ambition, pride, envy, jealousy, and other feelings, other emotions. Conflicts aren't going anywhere. If not with us, then with China. If not with China, then with India or Pakistan. If not with them, then with North Korea or with another country that suddenly becomes a nuclear state. Each time, we have to hope that, here and now, the system of political balances will make it possible to avoid the worst. It has always worked so far. We are seeing a very interesting situation now. On the one hand, the rhetoric that we see is very harsh. Neither the Soviet Union nor the West allowed themselves this level of rhetoric, except perhaps in the 1950s. And that was mainly attacks in the media. Today, politicians are making public statements that could be called absolutely boorish, things that would have been cause for war in the pre-nuclear era. But at the same time, despite the harsh rhetoric, the level of confrontation is nowhere even close to what took place in the 1980s. Whether for nuclear or for conventional weapons. Nuclear arsenals are significantly smaller than they used to be. The number of weapons has been drastically reduced, and the level of confrontation has dropped dramatically. The situation with conventional weapons is the same. Even despite the notorious demise of the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, the number of conventional weapons held by the parties is radically less than they held when the treaty was executed. Take a look at this comparison. Today, the number of composition of Russia's ground forces are approximately consistent with the group of Soviet forces in Germany during its heyday. Back then, that was only one group of Soviet forces, even if it was the most powerful one. Today, those are all the troops we have. The other party faces approximately the same situation. But that is no reason to relax, because war can happen even at such low level of confrontation, if the parties do not hear each other. Both sides have been struck deaf politically. Anyone who suggests hearing out the other side, accepting its arguments, and agreeing to some extent with the other side's position is charged with full-fledged treason. Here is a recent example. Germany's Navy commander remarked at a seminar with Indian colleagues that Crimea, in fact, belongs to Russia. He immediately resigned, just for stating a fact that should be taken as the starting point in today's picture of international relations. Simply stating facts that should be taken into account is a course for hostility. What happened? Why did the parties simultaneously become so sensitive to any violation of their worldviews and so unwilling to change those views? It's hard to say, at least without getting into social psychology or mass psychology. But that is what politics looks like today. It is exposed to robust interference and white noise. Public sentiment, in particular, that makes it very difficult to negotiate. To be honest, I can hardly imagine any agreement today that could accommodate the interests of both Russia and NATO without resulting in political suicide for the politicians involved, especially for Western politicians. In Russia's political environment, it is still possible for a decision made at the top level to be accepted at the grassroots level. That is not true in the West. Even if the US president suddenly decides to sign an agreement, his own establishment will devour him and lick its lips, destroying at the same time dozens of careers of those who assist or advise him. We are seeing a very interesting phenomenon. While traditional metrics, the number of conventional weapons, are not exactly irrelevant. They are losing their importance compared with the new capabilities provided by systems that people tend to overlook. Control systems, communication systems, reconnaissance, and target designation. These advanced technological capabilities provide access to a fundamentally new level of coordination that the largest armies can afford. For example, the US have been fine-tuning real-time interaction. A target detected by any weapon, whether satellite reconnaissance, radar, or even visual reconnaissance by a fighter, on the battlefield, with an appropriate terminal that transmits information to the network, can be fired upon immediately, and without loss of time for target designation, by any firing unit that is in the network and capable of receiving coordinates automatically. Human participation is essentially superfluous. In the past, hitting a target could take from hours to days from its detection, which greatly hampered military operations and created so-called fog of war, which had to be taken into account. We had to consider the lapse between the moment a situation was revealed and the moment we were able to strike, by which time the situation could have changed and the target data could be irrelevant. Today there are tactical-level opportunities for immediate strike, and these opportunities are growing. As the control system infrastructure is built up, as the parties receive new terminals and command posts, and as the satellite constellations that interconnect them are deployed, the geographical coverage also expands, and communication with other units and allies improves. With the development of new types of weapons, such as unmanned aerial vehicles, including strike vehicles, and as guided precision weapons are further introduced, we will soon see even smaller countries waging war. If any US allies have an appropriate weapon system, and most importantly, a control system, they are already able to follow this algorithm. Their capabilities will increase dramatically, even without a large army. We should keep a close eye on the procurement of modern systems by US allies around the world, from Eastern Europe to Japan and Australia. If you look at both the weapons they buy and the control systems that come with those systems, you see some interesting things. Poland, for example, which plans to purchase Patriot systems, F-35 fighters, new helicopters, and a number of other systems, will also receive a new integrated combat control system that will integrate all of those weapons, so they can operate as a single system as I described. This makes electronic warfare and cyberspace confrontation all the more important. The limiting factor for these capabilities will be each country's level of radio-electronic technologies in general, and computer technologies in particular. Countries that are out in front developing new technologies and fostering economic and industrial progress will also have a military advantage. Russia has to keep its finger on the pulse, because sanction regimes currently restrict our opportunities significantly. We see the threat and are working on developments. We have even tested some of them, and the US does. Unfortunately, the current level of Russian electronics keeps us from deploying such systems on a scale sufficient for a military of our size. This problem cannot be solved through imports from China, even if China was prepared to sell us everything it has. Among other reasons, China does not want to lose the civilian market in the West, where it also faces restrictions, including on transfers of military technologies to Russia. Unfortunately, Chinese manufacturers often observe Western sanctions as strictly as their European peers. In terms of the political situation, we are seeing the center of gravity of the global confrontation shifting toward China and toward the Pacific Ocean. The key confrontation of the 21st century is between China and the United States, primarily at sea. The Chinese fleet has seen both quantitative and qualitative upgrades, and it has virtually outsized the US fleet. China is increasing its heavy ship capabilities, although in this domain, the United States is still ahead, and will remain ahead for a long time. That said, the Chinese fleet is already undertaking significant, large-scale operations far offshore, which could result in the United States having trouble maintaining its maritime dominance in the Pacific, even given its strong allies in the region, primarily Japan, which has the most powerful fleet of the US allies today. By the early 2030s, this may lead to Chinese superiority in the Western Pacific, which the United States could only offset by concentrating its entire fleet there. It is difficult to forecast whether it would undertake that kind of concentration, or whether the political situation in other countries and regions would allow it to do so, given, among other factors, the current state of relations between Russia and the United States in Europe. One way or another, the European theater of operations has been of secondary interest of the United States for several years. It is mainly trying to deploy in the Pacific and curb the Chinese growth. The Pacific theater will preserve its key role and intensify as Asian countries emerge as economic leaders and as the Indo-Pacific region accounts for an increasing share of global gross domestic product. I believe that this is the major trend that we will have to live with for several decades. We need to reassess our own global posture, because we are still positioning ourselves as a European country first and foremost. Relations with Europe, including Eastern Europe, are much more important to us politically than anything happening in Asia. But it shouldn't be the way, because all the centers are shifting to Asia. Both the economic and military centers of gravity. And if our center of attraction remains in Europe, we will eventually find ourselves on the periphery of global development. It is not yet clear how we can change this vector. But at least we are considering our options, looking at opportunities, and acknowledging that we need to focus on economic development in the Far East. These considerations, however, need to become a long-term strategy that maps our very specific steps and is supported by appropriate military development. For now, unfortunately, our military capabilities in the Far East do not meet our needs. Because with the current balance of forces, we could lose a hypothetical conflict with Japan if we tried to solve the problem of the Kuril Islands by military means today. We do retain nuclear weapons, which is an argument, but a very weak argument in a situation where one has to either lose a conventional conflict or escalate it with the use of nuclear weapons. We need forces in the Far East that would allow us to make a non-nuclear argument and defend our political and economic interests by means of conventional military power, and without resorting to the nuclear threat, which is always a last and undesirable resort.